Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 16th of February, where we are talking about short stories, specifically Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And I gave an extension for our first journal until the 23rd, Tuesday, so that would give us enough time to finish up with our short story unit. And where we are now is talking about three very different short stories. Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne is an allegory. So it's very representational and very figurative, as many of you indicated in your attendance question when you were talking a little bit about faith and how faith represents not just Goodman Brown's wife, but also his religious faith and his faith in humanity. And young, when we think about young Goodman Brown, young oftentimes represents innocence or being naive. And Goodman would have been a title that would have been used during the time period, much like Mr., but Goodman is indeed a good man. And Brown can also be viewed from a symbolic or allegorical perspective. Brown is oftentimes the color associated with soil, and we could say that Goodman Brown becomes soiled when he learns the truth about humanity. Now, it's important to understand Puritanism in order to truly understand this particular piece. It was written in 1835 by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, being from New England, would have been very much influenced by Puritanism. And in fact, Nathaniel Hawthorne had ancestors who were associated with the Salem witch trials, and he felt a good amount of shame and embarrassment about that. And he oftentimes would write texts that would discuss the flaws associated with Puritanism. And Puritanism is directly related to what occurred during the Salem witch trials, in that Puritanism is a very strict religious doctrine in which there is either pure good or else there's evil, and there's no in between in the world. Very strict set of guidelines in which pleasure was denied so that it could ultimately be found in the afterlife. And the Salem witch trials were oftentimes ways to persecute those individuals who did not fall within Puritan guidelines. More often than not, they happen to be females who were unmarried. And the Salem witch trials grew into a large amount of hysteria where people were in paranoia, accusing each other of cavorting with witches and with Satan. And the Salem witch trials, as you know, or I believe you know, is one of the darker parts of Massachusetts history. And one of the reasons why I wanted to assign this particular text is because, being from Massachusetts, or at least Greenfield Community College being from Massachusetts, I'm assuming that most of you either reside in Massachusetts or in one of the closely surrounding states, that it would be interesting to know a little bit about our history. And when we think about something like some of the blue laws that exist in Massachusetts, for instance, places that will not sell alcohol on Sundays before 12 a.m., that's directly related to Puritanism, in that Sunday was viewed as the day of worship of God. And the idea of not selling alcohol on Sunday at all was supposed to be the best way to honor the idea of celebration and religious observance. However, Massachusetts, as you know, is surrounded by multiple border states, and those states do sell alcohol on Sunday. So the compromise that Massachusetts came to was that they would sell alcohol on Sunday so that they could compete with their bordering states, but they would sell alcohol after 12 o'clock so that the morning would be devoted to religious worship. So the commercial interests found a way to have a compromise, if you will, with the religious interests in relation to Puritanism. But if you've ever wondered why it is that in Massachusetts you cannot buy alcohol on a Sunday morning, that's the reason why. So The Salem witch trials is the setting for this particular piece because it does take place in Salem, Massachusetts, and all of the associations that come with Salem. And we know that young Goodman Brown and his wife Faith are newlyweds. This is important that they are newlyweds because, again, this represents being innocent and being naive. And the I suppose major conflict at the beginning of the story is that Goodman wants to go into the wilderness, which is wild and untamed, and those newlyweds have been married for 3 months. 3 is a significant number because it has lots of Christian associations in terms of resurrection. And then in the woods, Goodman encounters some sort of a traveler figure that could be the devil. Now, throughout the text, we see deliberate ambiguity. In other words, we can never be certain whether or not there is actually a witch meeting that occurs or it is a dream that Goodman experiences. In fact, Hawthorne directly addresses this by asking the question at the very ending of the story: had Goodman Brown fallen asleep and merely dreamed a dream of a witch meeting? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, yeah, whatever. And that is not that important. What is important is exposing the sin and the hypocrisy that exists within humanity and that exists within Puritanism. Because as Goodman is on his journey, and there's a long literary tradition of linking the idea of a literal journey with the journey of life. When Goodman is on his journey, he encounters church leaders that would seemingly be on their way to this witch meeting, including Goody Cloyce, and that is particularly disturbing for Goodman because she taught him his catechism, or another way of saying that, she was his Sunday school teacher. Politicians are on this road. Professionals are on this road. Widows are on this road. Family members are on this road. So it would seem that if there is a witch meeting, everyone who has portrayed themselves to be innocent and filled with goodness is on their way to this evil gathering. Of course, at the beginning of the story, Faith tries to keep Goodman from going into the woods, and he says that he needs to take this journey. So embedded within this is that Goodman knows that going into the wilderness comes with a certain level of darkness and a certain level of possible evil, and he does it anyway. So not only are church leaders and politicians and professionals on this road to evil, but so is Goodman. And the story basically is talking about how all of us have to take a journey and lose our innocence and learn the reality of humanity, that humanity has sin and that we ourselves have sin within us. So whether or not there's actual a witch meeting or a dream, we can never know because there are an equal number of pieces of evidence to show that there is indeed some sort of a supernatural element associated with the text. But on the other hand, there are an equal number of pieces of evidence that would seem to indicate that Goodman is dreaming about the episode that happens to be occurring. And the traveler's staff is a great example of this, where it would seem that the traveler's staff actually wriggled. And I believe a couple of you actually used that as the quotation that you wanted to discuss, in that the snake has lots of biblical associations, especially with the temptation of Adam and Eve and their fall in the Garden of Eden once they embraced knowledge that they weren't supposed to embrace. And that snake is supposed to evoke those images of the devil and of descent into temptation. So if indeed the traveler has a supernatural snake that's wriggling, that would seem to indicate that this is a supernatural being. But immediately after that, we're told that it must have been some sort of ocular deception of the uncertain light, which is another way of saying that he must have been seeing things in the bad light. Now, of course, I know the language sounds a little bit archaic because it would have been written in the 1800s, so it might be a little bit more challenging to read this particular piece. But the lesson to us is as timely and contemporary as any lesson, that religion and humanity and Goodman himself all have the possibility of sin within them. And the lesson is not to be destroyed by that knowledge, which is what happens with Goodman, is that he believes that everyone is at that witch meeting, including his own faith. Again, that's literal and that's figurative. But instead of dying with no hopeful curse upon his tomb, which is what happens to Goodman, because he becomes a darkly meditative and it basically a man that is completely against the ideals of religion and goodness and charity. We're supposed to accept that yes, that there will be hypocrisy in the world and there will be sin in the world, but we should not let that destroy us. And it's a lesson that probably all of us have to face at one point or another in our lives when we have put our faith in someone or something to find that our faith has been shattered, whether it be a political figure or it be a religious figure or it be a family member or even ourselves. And to see that ultimately there is no such thing as pure goodness and pure perfection. But again, the lesson is that should not destroy us. That should ultimately inspire us to continue forward. So those are some of the elements that I wanted you to think about in terms of Goodman Brown. And I had indicated that there was one text of this semester that was deliberately ambiguous, so much so that deconstructionists very much enjoy that text. And it's this text, Young Goodman Brown. And if you remember, the deconstructionist idea of examining literature is that there is contradiction within everything. And ultimately, all of that contradiction negates any kind of meaning so that it collapses upon itself and it means nothing at all. Almost like adding a positive and a negative number, and you end up with a zero. And if you were to do this with Young Goodman Brown, to have a list of all of the episodes that would seem to indicate supernatural events, you'd have an equal number of episodes that would seem to indicate that this was some sort of a dream on Goodman Brown's part. And it should be, if you think about something like the scales of justice, an equal balance between the two. Because again, the lesson is not that, or the point of the story is not that whether or not we should consider this actually happening or not happening. The lesson is that we should take from it is that there is ultimately hypocrisy and there ultimately is sin, regardless of what the Puritan ideology states. Now, if you think about little details, things like Faith's ribbons, which could be used perhaps as a piece of evidence to show that she was at the witch meeting, because Goodman did see her ribbons there, and then the next day he saw her wearing her ribbons. I know you could easily perhaps explain that away by saying that she has two pairs of ribbons, though in the 1800s it was less likely to have multiple pairs of items in the way that we do today. But the color pink is even more important because while pink in our contemporary society might represent innocence and purity and youth, at the time of Puritanism, color represented sin. And the assumption was that anyone using color could be engaged in sin, even Faith herself. So right from the beginning of the story, what we get is Hawthorne presenting us with a character that might be tainted. Pink is an interesting color, as we talked about with Rose for Emily, in that the color rose or pink is a combination of red, which is associated with lust and danger and blood and evil, and is also associated with white. Now, it's a mixture of the two, and white can represent purity and innocence. And we see both of that mixed up with Faith. So I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about Soldier's Home and also talk about finally Battle Royal, knowing that I can go back next class and fill in some details with some quotations and so forth. And finally ends with our two short stories, and they are very short indeed. One is entitled Girl, and one is entitled Popular Mechanics, and they're each about a page long or so. That would put closure on our short story unit, so then we could transition over into talking about how to write a paper, and also transition over to our next unit, which happens to be drama. But Outside of thinking about Young Goodman Brown as a historical analysis of where we live today, Massachusetts, or perhaps a place that we are all associated with today, Massachusetts, you can also think of Young Goodman Brown as a wonderful example of an allegorical story. Now, Soldier's Home tends to be a reader favorite. Hemingway tends to be a reader favorite because his style of writing tends to be much less complex. But that said, just because he is writing in simple language, that doesn't mean that his themes are simplistic, anything but. And this particular story, Soldier's Home, being about a veteran trying to return home, is unfortunately just as timely today as it was at the time in which Hemingway wrote this. And as some of you had indicated in your responses to the attendance question, Hemingway himself had experience with serving in the war, and one would think, based on the writing that he's done, that in one way or another, his experiences helped inspire him with his works. Though we need to be cautious, because just because someone is writing about their life experiences, that doesn't mean that they aren't also fictionalizing as well, which is what you can do when you are a short story writer or any kind of a creative writer. This piece was written in 1925, and the title, Soldier's Home, really sets the stage for us to ask, what is home? And what is the difference between a home, the physical structure, or I should say, what is the difference between a house, the physical structure, and a home, the place where you feel valued and wanted and needed? And Krebs is back in his house, the physical structure, but he's not necessarily back home. So if you've ever heard the expression that you can never go home again, then you can perhaps understand what it is that Hemingway is trying to do in this particular story. What we see, we would probably call PTSD in our contemporary times with Krebs. At the time, it was known as shell shock. The sense that a soldier is changed by their experiences in the military, and when they return home, they are no longer the same person that they once were. And while this is something that is challenging even in today's world, you can imagine how challenging this would have been in the early 1900s, when basically war was portrayed as one's patriotic duty, and there really wasn't an understanding and examination of psychology and trauma and the way that there is today. Krebs, interestingly, is referred to by his surname throughout most of the story, and the surname is the way that a military military soldier would be referred to when they are in the military. So that sense that he's never really left. His mother calls him Harold. That makes sense. And that ultimately she's birthed him. And his sister calls him Hare. So there's a nickname here. And it's Hare as in Hare, representing rabbit. The fact that his sister is using a nickname would indicate that he perhaps has a closer relationship with her. And the name Hare and all of the associations with rabbit, being scared and skittish, works very nicely for what Harold might be experiencing now that he has returned back from the war. Also, interestingly, Krebs, Harold's last name, happens to mean cancer in German. And one could say that war is a kind of cancer that just continues to grow and spread and overtake. The military picture we're shown at the very beginning shows the ugly reality that Krebs has of war, which would have been, again, portrayed as something that would be romanticized and something that would be sold as a patriotic duty. But instead, the uniforms don't fit, the Rhine doesn't show in the picture, the girls are not pretty. And the way the military would have been promoted during this time period is that the military would be a chance to see the world, such as the Rhine. But again, the Rhine doesn't show in the picture. The military would be a way for men, because men were the soldiers at the time. That would be a way for men to attract women. But again, we see that the uniforms don't fit well, so that doesn't make them particularly attractive. And the women there are not pretty. So that's the ugly reality that Krebs is experiencing, as opposed to the way that the military would promote itself during the time. And note the contrast of that particular picture with the fraternity picture at the beginning of the story with Krebs and his friends, and they're all wearing the same style collar. In other words, in some ways, he has been indoctrinated into being like others when he was in college. It is a Methodist college. One assumes that religion has played some sort of an important role in his life because he did attend a Methodist college, and his mother obviously is quite religious. In fact, she even wants him to pray at one particular point. But this is one of the major pieces of this story, is that Krebs questions religion and in fact is unable to pray, and one suspects it's because of the experiences that he's had in the military, that he's beginning to question things like religion and God now that he's seen such horror and death and destruction. We know that he returns later than the others from the war, so he doesn't get a hero's welcome. This says quite a great deal about civilians, about how fickle and superficial they are, in that ultimately they are not giving Krebs the kind of acknowledgement that Krebs deserves. His service is in no way negated by the fact of when he does or does not return, but that's not the way that the civilian world sees it. They've moved on. He's no longer interesting. And we see how Krebs basically spends his time in isolation. His solitary activities in particular, he spends his time reading, he's at home eating lunch, he's playing pool, he's practicing the clarinet. Again, these are all things you can do on your own. Playing pool is particularly interesting because when you play pool, you have to aim and shoot, which is very similar to probably what he had to do when he was a soldier. Hemingway is very specific and very careful with details. His details have significant meaning. And the fact that Krebs doesn't want to have any kind of consequences is perhaps played out with his hesitancy about getting a job, with his hesitancy about having a relationship with a woman or with anyone for that matter, with his hesitancy for basically everything. Now, I think one of the reasons why Hemingway is so popular is because, in addition to fairly clear language, it's also dialogue driven. Hare's conversation with his sister, for instance, is particularly interesting when Harold or Hare is talking with his sister, and she asks, "Will you be my beau?" Or, in other words, my boyfriend. And I know that's raised a few eyebrows for individuals who've read that particular piece and wondered, is there something inappropriate going on here? No, this is more like a hero worship of what a younger sibling might have for an older sibling. In some ways, Hare or Harold has the closest relationship with the sister than of any of his other family members. And he basically humors her by saying, "Yes, I can be your beau," understanding that they could never really have a romantic relationship. In other words, when Harold talks about how he preferred the German girls, there's a very specific reason why, because they had limited or no English skills, so he didn't really have to have an intimate conversation with them in the way that he would have to have with a woman back in the United States. And of course, that is his hesitancy, is that he doesn't want consequences and he doesn't want to get too close to anyone, because in war you have to be prepared to lose somebody who's close to you. So when Harold tells his mother, "No, I don't love you, I don't love anybody," it's probably, there is some level of truth to that, and that love comes with consequences, and love also comes with vulnerability and the possibility of being hurt, something that he doesn't want to experience anymore. His conversation with his mother is quite telling. And part of the reasons why it's so telling is because she basically is serving as a translator for the father. Krebs and his father never have a direct conversation with one another, which tells us how distant their relationship is. And we don't know if their relationship was that distant prior to him leaving the war, but we know it's that way now. And when Harold's mother talks to him, she talks about how his father has decided that Harold can now use the car. Now, the car is this universal symbol of freedom, ask any adolescent. And The idea that Krebs would be given access to something he hadn't been given access to shows that there's a certain level of respect for him. But considering what he's experienced at war and the fact that his family cannot understand the brutalities he's seen, in some ways it's almost condescending, acting like he's a teenager where they are offering him, honestly bribing him with the car, because the car does come with strings and the cost is too high for Krebs. The car comes with the expectation that he will get a job and that he will marry and that he will buy a home and that he will be, quote, normal, unquote, whatever that happens to be. And he understands that he doesn't need that particular kind of pressure, nor can he live up to the expectations of his family at this particular point in time. In the ending, he decides that he's going to go to Kansas City and get a job and also watch his sister play indoor baseball, which we can see as a positive ending on some levels because it seems that he's trying to reintegrate himself back into society. But we can also see it as a negative because we know he's not ready to reintegrate himself back into society. So in some ways, he's just doing what is expected of him. And going to Kansas City could be seen as a way of running away from his problems rather than confronting them. Though, of course, he might be smart enough to understand that no one is ever going to change in his family. Therefore, what he needs to do is to set out on his own. This is a very difficult piece because ultimately we want to empathize with Krebs, but we also understand the need for Krebs to move beyond the place that he is so that he can become a productive member of society. But how to do that and when to do that is the question. And it's a question we grapple with in contemporary times. So you can imagine how difficult it would have been in the early 1900s to deal with these questions. The last short story that I had assigned for us was actually an opening chapter of a novel, Invisible Man. And the novel is about 400 or 500 pages long, and it's an absolutely phenomenal novel because of its incredible use of detail. It reads much like a short story. That said, it was both a blessing and a curse for the author, Ralph Ellison. He wrote it when he was young, and it was considered to be brilliance. So people were expecting him to produce works that were as good as, if not better, and he was unable to do so. So basically, he had to live in the shadow of this particular work. Ralph Ellison is a African-American author, and his story, Invisible Man, happens to be about an African-American narrator. And this would have been in 1947, so we're talking about the height of racism and discrimination. And this opening chapter of the novel gives us a sense of what this narrator is going to be experiencing. What we have is an adult who's reflecting back on his youth. But I wanted to basically fill you in on the rest of the novel because at the ending of the first chapter that we read, he gets a scholarship to go to a, quote, Negro, unquote, college. This is not a positive thing, which is foreshadowed with the dream that he has at the end with his grandfather at the circus, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But basically, for the next 200 pages or so, he goes to college. And what he finds out is that he will continue to be an invisible man. No one will ever acknowledge his individuality because of his ethnicity. And that's why he's invisible. That's all that he's seen as. And after experiencing that in college, he realizes that this was not the answer. That instead what he has to do is to change the political system itself. So he tries to change the political system itself for the next couple hundred pages or so. And he realizes that he will never be seen as an individual. He will only be an invisible man because of his ethnicity. So the promises of education and the promises of politics are hollow, empty promises for him and for the African American community. So then for the last couple hundred pages or so, he ends up meeting a character by the name of Ross the Destroyer, and he lives up to his name. He is a destroyer. And Ross tells him that the only way for change is to dismantle the system and start fresh. So that's exactly what the destroyer does with the Invisible Man, is they try to destroy the system. And at the very ending, they have incited a riot, and they see their entire community burning down in front of them. And the Invisible Man realizes this is not the answer either, and that all he's doing is hurting himself and hurting his community. So what he ends up doing is he decides that he needs to, what he says, hibernate. And if you think about what hibernation is, it's kind of like taking a time out. To sort of contemplate things. He ends up going into a basement in a building of a community that would never allow him to live in that neighborhood because of the color of his skin. But he's living in the basement, and again, he's basically squatting. And he's talking about how he would never be allowed to be there. The basement is dark. That said, it is also illuminated because he has rigged up thousands or at least hundreds of light bulbs so that he's surrounded by light. And this theme of darkness and light is something that we see throughout the text. And he talks about how he's stealing this light from the electric company, or he's stealing power from the power company. Again, another theme that's embedded within the particular text. Not just light and dark, but power, who has it, who doesn't. And that basically he's going to stay there and hibernate and think about his choices. So that gives you an idea of the novel as a whole, though of course you really have to read the novel to truly understand it. The chapter that we read, Battle Royal, is about a battle, but there are multiple battles in this particular piece. The Invisible Man is awarded the opportunity to deliver his graduation speech in front of the leading citizens of the town, which he thinks is a very positive thing. And he talks before this about how his grandfather on his deathbed had said that he was a spy in the enemy's country, and that you had to live with your head in the lion's mouth and overcome them with yeses. If you think about what being a spy means, is that you're going into enemy territory in order to get intelligence. In other words, the grandfather was pretending to be meek so that he could interact in the Caucasian community so that he could gain access for the attempt of eventual overthrow. In other words, the grandfather lived with his head in the lion's mouth, the lion being the Caucasian community, and that he was always at risk. And he would overcome them with yeses, that this is the way that he would fool the community in order to be able to gain access. But when the Invisible Man first hears this in his youth, he doesn't understand what it means. And it's only throughout the course of the novel as a whole that he begins to understand what his grandfather was trying to teach him. Though the very beginnings of his understanding start with that battle royal, where the leading citizens are there, supposedly to hear the speech, but what we find out is that the narrator has been called there to engage in a boxing match with other African Americans. And we see how brutal and humiliating this boxing match is. Plus, we see the use of the N-word, which gives us a sense of the historical time period. Before the match, a naked blonde is presented in front of them. So we see the objectification of female, but she also has an American flag tattooed on her stomach. And the American flag is the symbol of America. And she symbolizes America for these African Americans, that they can look, but they can't touch. They can be shown the American dream, but they can never realize it on their own. And in fact, during this time period, we see how they are humiliated and that they can't help but show sexual excitement when they see this blonde woman. But showing any kind of interest in a Caucasian woman could mean death for an African American. So they're deliberately set up to put them in these humiliating and degrading situations. Lots of black and white imagery here when we think about tuxedos, which is what the leading citizens are wearing. Tuxedos are black and white. They are smoking black cigars. And in fact, the idea that they're smoking or consuming something that's black could be the way that they are consuming the African Americans for their entertainment and for their perverse pleasure. Even the scholarship that the Invisible Man is given is wrapped in white tissue paper, again, for that white and dark imagery, in a briefcase. A briefcase is supposed to be representation of success, professional success, and academic success. The boxing match is a metaphor for all of the societal and personal battles that the Invisible Man is experiencing and will experience. The Invisible Man is fighting not just against the other boxers, but he's also fighting against himself, and he is fighting against the leading citizens. And in some ways, those leading citizens remind me of some of the leading citizens that we were introduced to in Young Goodman Brown, who seem to be involved in something that's nefarious. And that's exactly what's happening here. And finally, the Invisible Man is in a battle with the last boxer. It turns out this has all been a setup so that he can fight the strongest boxer. And the Invisible Man tries to make a deal with this other boxer, saying, let's fix this fight, pretend that I knocked you down. And the other boxer refuses. And the Invisible Man doesn't understand. And he asks, why are you doing this, for them? And the other boxer says, no, for me. In other words, that this is the only pride that he can get is in winning this match, that everything is so degrading and so humiliating. This is the only option he has. In fact, even at the ending of this boxing match, there's supposed to be payment. They were never paid. There's fake payment. There are tokens that are on an electrified rug, again, reinforcing that idea of electricity, and they're actually shocked with power. Again, a reference to the idea of the power structure of society. And then finally, after all of these horrors, the Invisible Man is able to give his graduation speech. And of course, he's convinced that if he could just give this speech, then ultimately he'll be respected. But from a subconscious level, he understands what his grandfather has said, so much so that, in fact, he even tries, during the time that the Naked Blonde is dancing, to topple over one of the chairs of one of the leading citizens there. So in other words, he's engaged in subversive behavior, even though he's giving a speech about social responsibility. And then he makes an error. And instead of saying social responsibility, he says social equality, which is very different. And everything stops. And of course, he's questioned, and he says, I was swallowing blood. And that's literal and figurative here, of course. And social equality, well, he says it was just an error. From a psychological perspective, there is this idea that there are no errors, that when we make a misstatement, it's just a way of our subconscious trying to influence our conscious self. But whether you agree or disagree with that, at the very ending, he has a dream about his grandfather. And this is some negative foreshadowing, that the dream he has is that he's at a circus and that his grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. In other words, his grandfather refuses to do what is expected of him. And the grandfather instructs him to basically open up an envelope. And in that envelope is another envelope and another and another. It's almost like those nesting dolls that you might have seen. And then in the last envelope, it's told that keep this end boy running. In other words, that he is never going to be able to achieve dignity or respect or access in society because of the color of his skin and because the system is set up in such a way to not allow him to ever have equal opportunity. Again, dreams are oftentimes representational of one's subconscious mind, and that dream is something that will be haunting him throughout the entire novel. He says he doesn't really understand what that dream meant, that he needed to go to college first. And as I indicated, he went to college with high hopes, believing the American dream that with education, ultimately one could achieve equality. And what he finds out is that one can achieve equality if one is not African American. And he's disappointed by not only the educational system, but also the political system as well, that all men are created equal. That, of course, leaves out 50% of the population, female, and all men, usually in reference to Caucasian men. So the time period of the story is obviously very important, but sadly, here we are in 2021, still grappling with many of the same issues of race and sexism that are examined in this particular story. So I think that all three of these stories have contemporary relevance to them, as well as our lenses into the time period in which they were written. As I indicated, I wanted to talk a little bit more about all three and highlight some important quotes, and then finally put some closure on our short story unit next class. But I thought that for today's attendance question, which would be due on Wednesday, the 17th at 10 a.m., out of the three stories from this class, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, did you dislike the most? Did you dislike the most, and why? Because it's perfectly fine to dislike some of these stories as well as to like some of these stories. So I'm curious to hear as to which story of the three you're going to identify and why. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a way to encourage dialogue. And I ask you to read your classmates' responses as well as my responses as well, because this would be a sense of what we would have talked about in class. And then next class, we'll put some closure to our short story unit, and then we can move forward to start talking about writing papers, and finally to talk about a new genre of literature, drama. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye bye.